Good evening, Sigma Chi brothers and friends. Welcome to the May 2025 edition of SigTalks. I'm Jim Cooper, member of the New York City area alumni chapter and chair of the SigTalk programs. Joining me as co-moderator tonight is Bruce Kastner. Bruce is president emeritus of the Washington alumni chapter, former chair for the board of trustees, ritual master, and an Order of Constantine SIG. Before introducing our guest speaker, I'm going to set the stage for his intriguing talk. What I'm about to say comes from an abstract titled, "The Coming Cyberspace Cold War with Russia." And here it is. There is a very good reason Russia has not deployed its latest cyber weapons against Ukraine. They're saving them for the United States in what may be the beginning of a modern Cold War played out in cyberspace. NATO has declared cyber to be an operational domain and subject to Article 5 in case of a massive cyber attack. You might remember Article 5 is an attack on one is an attack on all. But what does a massive cyber attack mean? Russia will play the fringes in gray space of policy to conduct low-intensity warfare using its tools and tactics refined against adversaries like Ukraine. The result, for the United States, unrestricted warfare against our critical infrastructures, espionage operations targeting the software supply chain, and new cyber weapons. Sounds ominous? It certainly does. So, joining us this evening to shed light and expand upon this foreshadowing of a cyberspace Cold War is Morgan Wright. Morgan is an internationally recognized expert on cybersecurity strategy, cyberterrorism, national security, and intelligence. He currently serves as a senior fellow at the Center for Digital Government and the Chief Technology Analyst for Fox News and Fox Business. Previously, Morgan was the Chief Security Advisor for SentinelOne, Senior Advisor in the U.S. State Department Antiterrorism Assistance Program, and Senior Law Enforcement Advisor for the 2012 Republican National Convention. In addition to 18 years in state and local enforcement as a highly decorated state trooper and detective, Morgan has developed solutions in defense, justice, and intelligence for the largest technology companies in the world, including Cisco, UNISYS, and Alcatel-Lucent Bell Labs. So Morgan, welcome, and thank you for appearing on SigTalks tonight.
Hey, well, you can blame Bruce Kastner if this bombs because he's the one that invited me, so I appreciate it so much. Thank you guys for having me on.
Well, Bruce hasn't failed us yet, so I'm sure we're going to have a great talk tonight. Morgan, let's get started by learning a bit about your pre-Sigma Chi years. Where were you born and raised? And please describe for us what life was like before you enrolled in college.
So actually, I was born at Fort Riley. I was a military brat. My dad was World War II and a Vietnam vet. So we moved around. I was born at Fort Riley. We went from Fort Bragg to Monterey, California through language school. And I spent 3 years in Iran. My first foreign language I spoke was Farsi. So I grew up in the days of the Shah. We moved back to Dodge City, Kansas. He went to Vietnam out of Canyon City, Colorado. Went to South Bend, Indiana. He taught ROTC at Notre Dame. So I was there to watch Rudy Rudiger and Ara Parsegan back in the day, and Joe Theismann. So his name was Theismann, but it was they changed it to Theismann because he was running for Heisman that year, Theismann for Heisman. And then I ended up back in Chapman, Kansas. My dad retired out of the military out of Fort Riley, Kansas. So we started life there, ended there. And I went to Chapman High School, and that's where I was in music. And that's what led me eventually into Fort Hays State University.
Well, so, being, I guess, what they call a military brat has its advantages in terms of a lot of great experiences that you get. You chose Fort Hays State, as you mentioned, in Kansas, a school well known to Sigma Chi's, as where our current Grand Consul, Bob Wilson, is also an alum. So what was behind the decision to enroll at Fort Hays, and what was your major area of study there? And I don't know. Maybe you can tell us something about Bob if you
Oh,
overlapped in terms of your years.
oh boy, can I? So real quick, what I went there, I was used to go to band camp at Fort Hays State. I was a music major, and so I ended up getting a couple of scholarship offers. One of them was from Fort Hays State, so that's where I ended up meeting my. That's how I ended up actually getting into Sigma Chi, was because my big brother, who ended up being that, was in the band with me, and he was a drummer, and he brought me over one night. That's the whole thing started. But let me tell you my quick Bob Wilson story. Piece of advice: if Bob Wilson advised you to go camping with him, say no. So there were 10 of us brothers one night. He said, hey, now remember, folks, at 18, you could drink at that time in Arkansas. So we said, hey, let's go grab a couple of 6-packs. We're going to go out. Bob's parents, I think her aunt and uncle, had a place out at Canopolis Reservoir, a trailer. We were going to go out there, sit around the campfire, just do brotherly things. It's November. It's cold. We get out there and we're looking forward to a heated trailer with running water. There was no heat, there was no running water, and no electricity. We spent the night with nothing because Bob Wilson led us astray. I will never go camping with Bob Wilson again.
Well, you better be ready to rough it, I guess, if you go out with Bob. I'm gonna ask you something that's a little off script here,
Sure.
but since you mentioned it, I once worked for a company that was developing computer equipment, and I worked with the product development people in software. And one of the directors there told me that if somebody had been a music major and understood music theory, that there was a connection to software and software analytics. Did you experience that at all with your background?
Yes, I did actually, but in a different way. So, years later, I ended up teaching behavior analysis, interview, and interrogation at the National Security Agency to damage assessment agents. So when there was they'd have an espionage case, a release of classified information, damage assessment agents were brought in to assess what's the damage to national security, polygraphs. So I taught at the National Cryptologic School, and as I'm talking to one of the special agents out there, a guy named Dave Sherman, I actually have the first business card NSA was ever allowed to use. But got to find out NSA liked to recruit musicians. Why? Because pattern analysis, music theory, you could see patterns. And it was easier to teach a music major mathematics and cryptography than it was to take a cryptographer and teach them music. So believe it or not, back in the day, NSA, which to your point, software developers, music majors were, because of the creativity, the left brain, right brain synchronization. But yeah, it was the ability to recognize patterns. Music majors were sought after for cryptography.
That's a fascinating point and something most people would just never know about. One more question relating to college days. So while at Fort Hays, you were drawn, I think, to Sigma Chi. Apparently, a lot of the best young men on the campus there taught Sigma Chi. Tell us what it was that drew you to our fraternity.
I don't want to get too personal, but my dad was a Vietnam vet. He had a lot of issues with Vietnam. My parents ended up getting divorced. We would call it PTSD now. It was a bad time. And so I grew up a lot without a father figure. He was military. He was gone a lot. And I grew up with 2 sisters, so I never had a brother. So I think when I got to college, this experience of having guys who cared about me, who wanted to hang out with me because of me, was strange because by the time I was in 5th grade, I'd lived in 8 different places. I was counting that up before we got on tonight. So I was always used to moving around, never forming attachments. So forming attachments was tough because you'd move somewhere, you didn't want to be friends with somebody because you ended up moving. Well, Steve Jarmer was his name. I tell you, it was great because I was a music guy. He was a music guy. Ended up finding that some of the other guys were music guys, but I think it was just the respect that I was given. And academically, Sigma Chi always did great at Fort Hays State. We did stuff like Derby Days from a philanthropic standpoint, which we did back then. So I think it was the whole thing of I found a way to fit in, and I found people who got me for who I was. And so it was something I'd never experienced before I was 17 when I hit college. I had to wait till I was 18 to legally drink. And believe it, I waited till I was 18 before I drank. But I'd never hung out with guys before like that. It was wrestling and stuff in high school. But Sigma Chi was the first time where I had experienced the bonds of fellowship, the bonds of brotherhood that I'd never experienced before in high school. Everything was transactional in high school. This was more very about let's create a relationship. As you can see, 40 years later, we're talking about Bob Wilson, and I go back years with many guys.
Well, that's one of the great things about fraternity life, and especially our fraternity. And we're going to, tap into a little bit more about you and Sigma Chi toward the end of your talk. But for now, I'd like to turn it over to Bruce.
Thank you, Jim. And Morgan, welcome again. Glad to have you. I'm happy to add, as by way of introduction, that Morgan is an enthusiastic member of the Sigma Chi community here in our nation's capital. He just recently won the Northern Virginia Alumni Chapter Officer of the Year and as a certified ritual peer. So Morgan, now that we know your Sigma Chi credentials, let's get to the heart of your subject matter for tonight's SIG Talk.
Sure.
What is the origin of this presentation?
So in 2013, I was part of a group of people. We were wargaming exercises out at National Defense University. And I decided, hey, nobody was really talking about cyber. So I said, I'll talk about cyber. So I looked at it and I said, the premise was, if Russia was going to invade Ukraine, how would they do it? And this was 2013. So I came up with a presentation that was called Cyber Strike, Warfare in the Fifth Domain, because cyber had just become the fifth domain of war. There was sea, air, land, space. So cyber became the fifth domain of war, cyberspace, officially about 2010 through an Air Force memo, then DOD adopted it. So I looked at it, and it was things about, so Bruce, when I briefed this, I was briefing this one time in Washington, D.C., and I had some people from the FBI and DHS in there, and I talked about how Russia would recruit people that would look similar to me, but then you would go on vacation and the person they got would get some plastic surgery to really resemble me, and then they would take that person and insert them in there, and I was just doing a Tom Clancy thing. It was like, hey, he did a lot of research, so I said, how would I want to get somebody inside something that was trusted? And I actually was speaking at the New York State Police Intelligence Summit, and I simply asked them a question: how do you know the person you hire that you met with is the same person showing up to training on day one? And they had no way to verify that. They weren't doing fingerprints. They weren't doing additional background checks. And so I told them the story about how Russia, I believed, was the way you get trusted access is, Bruce, you would go through we both have this fantastic gray hair, right? You'd go through the process. But then at that time, once you get through your fingerprints, your social background, I'd pull you out and I'd insert the plant, the double agent in there that was very similar to you. And the fact is, most people, they'd have, New York State Police had 1,000 people coming through there. They would not know that it was not the same guy because you looked close enough. So then you'd get the trusted access. And so I had these guys come up to me and go, how'd you know that? I said, well, first of all, thanks for validating. And second, I didn't know, but it was a logical guess. But that's how it came out of it. It just came out of what would it look like. And then when Ukraine was invaded by Russia, about 85% of what I had in my briefing was factually accurate. I mean, it's what happened. And so I changed the briefing now to what we're talking about now is, now that they've done it, what does the coming Cold War in cyberspace look like with Russia? And regardless of what Russia says or does or what they negotiate with us, trust me, we're at war with them in cyberspace every day, every minute of every hour of every day.
Well, actually, it's happened twice since you gave that presentation. So you really had a grip on the future. You're showing a picture of a dam right now. How is this significant to the current war you're describing?
So this really gets into the history of Russian intelligence. Russia's had the longest running intelligence operation. Now the Brits will say, well, no, mate, MI6. I said, nah. Back in your day, MI6, the gents back then, their version of espionage was gentlemen do not read other gentlemen's letters. And I'm like, that's the whole purpose of espionage, just to steal secrets, plans, and intentions. So what happened was, it started off Felix Dzerzhinsky created the V-Cheka, which became morphed into the NKVD. So during Operation Barbarossa, which was Hitler's plan to invade the Soviet Union, they were coming up through Ukraine. This is Zaporizhzhia hydroelectric plant on the Dnieper River. To stop the advance of German forces, Stalin had his NKVD go into Ukraine and blow up this dam. And this dam, when it blew up, there's a video, actually, this is actually the actual video from it. We're not playing the video tonight, but you can find this on the internet. I was doing research. It killed over 100,000 Ukrainians. And it's all because Russia was looking, how do we stop the German forces? So there's an old maxim, an old theory of war that says if you want to bring a nation to its knees, you go after two things, power and water. And that's what Russia was doing. They were looking to stop the advance, but also in the modern conflict, they also go after power and water. So this is the advent. This is how everything started. This was the how they used Russian intelligence to really stop the advance. And the NKVD became the KGB, which we all know of, and now it's the FSB, SVR. But Russia's had a long history with intelligence, but blowing up this dam was a key part of their countermeasures against the invasion of Germany.
Well, those included the famous scorched earth policy too, where they would just take down all the food supply and anything that the German army thought that they could salvage to feed themselves, sustain themselves.
So
they,
real quick,
they weren't kidding when they were doing that.
No, but I tell people, I said, so this dam is going to figure out later, but I said, but one of the largest attacks, actually the first what was called black energy attack, was it was the use of software to take out power to Western Ukraine, happened December 23rd, 2015. I say, people, why did they pick that date? Well, it's Christmas or people on vacation. I said, no, because on December 23rd, 2014, exactly 1 year before, Ukraine voted 303-8 to change their status from a non-aligned nation to an aligned nation so they could join NATO. And what does Russia not want on its southern border? They don't want NATO. So exactly 1 year later, Russia launched this operation against the same dam that they had attacked back in 1941, or that was attacked, or that they attacked in 1941. And so, I mean, when we talk about Russia and history, we'll talk about that later too, but they have a long sense of history. But this dam has been central to Russian plans and intentions for 60, 70 years.
They surely do remember their history going way back. We're going to bring up the slide of Checkpoint Charlie. That was an iconic representation of the conflict during the Cold War. But Morgan, what's the lesson we can learn from here?
So this is going to tie into the next slide we're going to also use, Bruce, but Russia has the long view of history. People have to remember Russia has been around for a couple thousand years in various forms, and configurations. And in fact, Ukraine, according to Russia, is a slur. It means like the outer lands. So the Ukraine says, no. So this whole thing with Russia and Ukraine goes back 200 to 300 years, not just 40 years, not just 20 years, but 200 years. But Checkpoint Charlie, I mean, this is the height of the Cold War. This is when they had the Warsaw Pact, we had NATO. But the whole thing here is that Russia has the long view of history. I mean, they are engaged in a Cold War. And Bruce, if we go to the next slide, one of the things that shows you about how this is, so normally this is a build slide, as I say, when I do this keynote for other people, I have people raise their hand and said, how many of you have been in your job for 5 years? Everybody raise your hand. If you've been at your job for 5 years or less, drop your hand. 10 years or less. By the time I get to 20, there's not very few hands up. Russia ran a campaign called Snake Malware that took us 16 years to identify and find, and another 4 years to actually eradicate it. And during that time, they got into thousands of computers in I think 80 countries. This is the persistence Russia has to run a campaign called Snake Malware for 20 years, where they were going after stuff. And in fact, Bruce, one of the things when I do this too, I have this press release here issued by the Department of Justice. And one of the key things that I read out of this, this was done May 9th, 2023. Like I said, remember, it took us 4 years to eradicate it. The U.S. government attributes to a unit within Center 16 of the Federal Security Service, the FSB. For nearly 20 years, this unit, referred to in court documents as Turtle, has used version of Snake Malware to steal sensitive documents from hundreds of computer systems in at least 50 countries, which have belonged to NATO, member governments, journalists, etc. They did this by using compromised computers all around the world. This is the persistence they have, 20 years to run just a single campaign.
Interesting stuff. Jim, why don't you pick it up from here?
Well, Morgan, you spoke about the snake malware, and I understand there are other different kinds of wares, and that you specify 4 types. What are they, and what are their significance?
Well, Russia, you got to remember too, any nation that can build nuclear weapons is going to be a top tier adversary in cyberspace. But I tell people that there's 4 types of ware. There's hardware, which you see here. There's software, and there's there's firmware, right? So the stuff that's in there. But I say, what's the 4th kind of ware? And you were just kind of alluding it to it, Jim. Some people say, it's malware. No, it's not. It's a euphemism CIA used back in the day to do what they called political, assassination. But it's called wetware. Russia is not attacking the way you code. Russia is attacking the way you think about the problem. So the wetware, what they're attacking is not your code. They're attacking the way you think about the code. And in fact, one of the things I'll tell you about, also do this thing where I call think outside the box, right? So a lot of people have heard think outside the box. And I say, how many of you heard think outside the box? People go, oh, I have. Well, where did it come from? Jim, in all my time, I've only had one person even come close to understanding where this originally came from. And I actually have to write it down. So it actually came from 1930. A researcher called Norman, he's got 4 names, Norman Raymond Frederick Meyer. I mean, it's like Lee Harvey Oswald and John Wilkes Booth. Strange characters have multiple names throughout history, but Norman Raymond Frederick Meyer, 1930, it was an article called Reasoning in Humans, the Journal of Comparative Psychology. What he did was he took college students and he looked at them and he said, how do they think about and how reasoning about how they solve problems? So I want to tell people, think outside the box. So what I do is I will draw a diagram up there and I'll have this slide with 3 dots, 3 rows of 3 dots. And I'll say, how many of you see a box? And everybody goes, yeah, I see a box. Well, you've already fallen into my trap because you've allowed me to define the problem. The minute I define the problem, I define the solution to your problem, the parameters to it. So what Russia excels at is thinking outside the box. The only way to solve what they call the 9-dot problem, Gestalt psychiatrists also used it in the 40s, but it originated in 1930. But it's how do humans reason about solving problems? The people who solve this more often than not are young children because they're not burdened with the baggage. You know, it goes back to when we talk about kids in school. Don't tell them to color within the lines. You're limiting them. Let them color, let them create. Well, Jim, the only way to solve the problem on those 3 rows of 3 dots is to go up and outside the box, come down through the 2nd and 5th dot or 6th dot, come back over and come back up. So there's 2 areas where you end up going outside the box. What I tell people, it's illegal, quite frankly. A lot of people think CIA, NSA, all these guys are breaking the law. No, we get paid to break the laws of other country, not our own. So we have to act within a framework of the law, but it doesn't prevent you from thinking outside the box. One of my friends retired as the chief of the director of science and technology at CIA, Glenn Gaffney, and I'm asking him one time, he said when he was working with his people, he said, if the rules of the game aren't working for you, don't change the rules, change the game. And what Russia did, I'll give you the quick example I'll give is the Chinese spy balloon. It's very instructive about how thinking outside the box worked. Everybody remembers the Chinese spy balloon, right? So we find it floating. Well, they said it was a weather balloon. The first time they used it, they sent it over. I guarantee you it was a weather balloon. What they were testing for, would we detect it? And when a general testified before the Senate, he said, well, it was a domain awareness gap. Now, that's a euphemism, which means we weren't operating in that space. And since we weren't operating in that space, we didn't think anybody else was. So we weren't worried about monitoring for anything in that space. Well, what China figured out is between like 45,000 feet and 100,000 feet, nobody was really watching that space. And they had a 300-foot tall balloon with a payload the size of a school bus floating through there, collecting. It was an intelligence platform. Don't kid yourself. But because we didn't operate in that space, we didn't think anybody else was. Now people say, well, it's 300 feet tall. How come they didn't find it? 300 feet tall, there's 5,280 feet in a single mile. We're talking about 8 to 10 miles, if not more, of airspace that were unmonitored. So you tell me about finding something that's only 300 feet tall in, 40,000, 80,000 feet of airspace that we were not monitoring. So they did it because, again, it's thinking outside the box. So these are novel ways. So you were talking about software. One of the things about software, they call it zero-day exploits. People finding unique ways to find a flaw that nobody else knows about that they use to exploit. So the ability to critically think is, I think, an art that's been lost in these latest generations. I mean, when I talk to some of the young brothers and some of the pledges, I always hit them up about, hey, you've got to really focus on thinking critically, think about solving the problem. But Jim, to kind of just close out on that's one of the biggest areas. It's the ability to think critically. And when we don't think we have to think outside the box. We have to act within the box legally, but we need to start thinking outside the box. And that's where Russia has excelled. By the way, who has proportionally more grandmasters in chess than any other country in the world? Russia.
Well, what's coming through here is that Russia is pretty sophisticated with all this. And, we don't really see that every day, but not really a surprise. Like you say, any country that can develop nuclear weapons certainly has a lot going for it in their critical thinking and what they can develop. Then the other point, we could probably do a whole show on China also, but I know you're going to come back to the Russian aspect of things as we move along. So then, with more recent events, please talk about the tactics that they're using in the Ukrainian war. What were some of the new things introduced?
So for our military folks out there, if any of you are military, first of all, salute. I was Walt Cooner, our Grand Praetor for the Eastern Province. We were doing investiture for George Washington, and didn't realize I was going to get it, but it was the military service Sigma Chi pin. So, but the reason I say that is if you're serving out there, law enforcement, first responder, military, this is my salute to you. But there's a phrase they call, Jim, they call intelligence preparation of the battlefield, IPB. And it really determines its scope. It's shaping the battlefield. Do you understand the context, the environment? One of the greatest examples of intelligence preparation of the battlefield was D-Day, the D-Day invasion, right? Operation Overlord. We had to know so much about the landing areas, the fortifications. But this is what Russia did. But the reason I say that is they did some very interesting things, which gets into, this is going to tie into the NATO comments. They did some unique things with distributed denial of service, but they had these things called hermetic wipers. So what these wipers were a piece of software code that they would go in and they would wipe out the operating system of whatever device they were on. So when they launched it against the satellite or the modems that controlled satellite to ground communications, because they relied on modems. Well, I don't want to throw the communications company under the bus, but I have met with them, a satellite communications company. But what happened was Russia created this malware called Hermetic Wiper, and it was designed to go in and erase this. And Jim, once you erase it, you cannot it's not a matter of rebooting. You've erased it completely. The only way to solve it, the only way to fix it is you have to go out and physically replace the router, to physically replace the modem. What they did, which got them in trouble, is they didn't put enough bounds, security bounds on the malware, and it jumped containment. So it went outside our Ukraine, and it ended up hitting Germany. When the war started, the German prime minister and some of the German people, the government officials, they said, yeah, we're not going to send Leopard tanks and we're not going to send anything to Ukraine. Well, when this thing jumped containment, it took out the routers and modems of 5,800 wind turbines in Germany. Remember what I said? You go after a country, you go after power and water. So it hit 58 of them. They had to replace 5,800 modems. So that's when Germany said, hey, I think we're going to help out. And that's when the Deputy Secretary of NATO came out and said, hey, look, we consider cyber to be an operational domain, a massive cyber attack. You have to define massive. Massive cyber attack on one means an attack on all, which is the original version of that is called the Washington Treaty. That's the right of collective self-defense, which after COVID, we had many people becoming Article 5 experts after being COVID experts. Right. Yeah. So, but that's what got into it. And so that's why, but the real story behind that too is they should have learned their lesson. In 2017, they created the NotPetya ransomware, and it was designed to attack the accounting system inside Ukraine. Well, it got out. Well, one of the people it attacked was Maersk, the giant shipping lines. Mm-hmm. And they had 56 locations around the world that had what's called Windows domain controllers. But basically, it's the brains of your operation. 55 of them, no, 57, 56 were down, wiped out, hit with a ransomware called NotPetya. It's the most destructive attack in history, over 10 billion or 12 billion and counting. There was one domain controller in, I think it was Yemen. And because the power grid in Yemen is pretty dodgy, it was offline. They called down there, said, do not turn the power back on, do not connect it. They flew a team from IBM down with Pelican cases to extract that one hard drive so that Maersk could get back up and running. But that's the power of malware. We're so dependent upon this internet connectivity and software, Jim, is that if I can take out your ability to communicate, I can take out your ability to operate. So these were the things that they were going after on this type of stuff. So yeah, and then things called acid rain. So actually it was in Nairobi. I'm sorry, Nairobi was the last Windows domain controller. So had it not been for that, Maersk might have been out of business for 6 months as opposed to just a few weeks.
And we all would have felt that. And, there's just a lot of vulnerabilities out there, as you're pointing out. And, and related to what you've been talking about is the volume of state-sponsored attacks. What would your comments be about those?
Not a trick question. If I said, who is behind, this is Microsoft research. If I said, who's behind 58% of all state-sponsored attacks? As of 2 years ago, it was Russia. Now, some people may say China because numerically they have a lot of people in the Ministry of State Security. They actually have a new cyber organization. They have reorganized their intelligence. But Russia was doing it because it was a force multiplier for them from an espionage standpoint, and a theft of R&D, weapons, things like that. So, but they were behind 58% of all state-sponsored activities. But here's the other key thing, though, too, Jim. They would use proxies. So they would use. So do you remember when the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack happened during COVID, and they shut down Colonial?
Yeah.
It was along the Eastern Seaboard, right?
Yep.
How did we react to a perceived shortage, not a real, just a perceived shortage of energy? Because all it did, we didn't lose a single drop of oil. What we lost was the ability for Colonial to understand where their oil was from an accounting and a finance and a logistics standpoint and move it around. So what Russia realized is that we could use a lot of proxies. And as long as it's a third party, it's not Russia, you don't invoke the Article 5 of the Washington, of the NATO treaty, right? So this group called DarkSide Ransomware Group was located in St. Petersburg and one other place in Russia. But they were, and this is topic that's going to come up, they were using proxies to do a lot. And look, we use proxies too. We use third parties so that we get what's called plausible deniability. But Russia has really used this a lot in the cyber world to inflict damage through the use of ransomware gangs and third-party proxies that inflict damage from a software and a cyber standpoint on nations and companies.
No surprise that they're up to those kind of tricks. I think we may have another picture of a dam. Yeah. This one looks a little like the one that was in slide 2, but inform us of vulnerabilities in our own critical infrastructures.
So this dam has been attacked at least four times by Russia. One time kinetically, they blew it up, and then the other times, actually one other time too, kind of kinetically, and then twice from a cyber standpoint. So this is the Zaporizhzhia hydroelectric dam that sits on the Dnieper River in the western oblast of Ukraine. This is a constant target for this, but here's what it means. So I came out of Kansas. Some of my friends went to the Kansas Bureau of Investigation when 4 Russians were indicted from what was called Center 16 unit, the main military unit 71330. A lot of times, Jim, you'll hear military units, Unit 61398 of the People's Liberation Army, military unit 71330. These are called military cover designators, and they're designed to confuse or create confusion about the actual attribution. Who's doing what are they doing? It's just a military cover designator. So, but what happened was 4 Russians were indicted. They'll never see the inside of a courtroom, Jim, because we don't have a extradition treaty with Russia, nor do we have one with China, which means none of those people will ever see the inside of a courtroom. But 4 Russians were indicted for a long-running campaign out of the from 2012 to 2018. Thousands of computers were hit. Well, one of them that was hit was Wolf Creek in southeastern Kansas, nuclear dam, Wolf Creek nuclear plant. I didn't ask them for classified information because you don't want to put people into a box having formally held access to classified information. I mean, you want to be sensitive and ethical about it. But I simply said on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being no problem at all, 10 being you're worried, where were you at this? They said, we're about a 12. One of the things we've been able to piece together is Russia, through their tactics, was able to get in through the IT side into the industrial control system and actually touch things that control the nuclear fuel rods and things like that. So, and a lot of people say, well, why didn't they do something? It goes back to intelligence appropriation of the battlefield and what the abstract was. What they are doing is cataloging vulnerabilities, cataloging our infrastructure so that if and when hostilities break out, and Russia needs to reach into their tool bag, which is what China's doing too. When we look at groups called Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, what they're doing to us on Guam, what they're doing to Taiwan, China's doing the same thing Russia's doing, cataloging vulnerabilities so that at the time and a place that they're choosing, should hostilities break out, they have a toolkit of tactics and weapons that they can use against the United States. So they were doing this. One of the main ones, though, back during COVID too, I don't know, some of the folks out there, and you may have heard about this, Jim, did you hear about what was called the SolarWinds campaign, the SolarWinds vulnerability?
No, I did not.
Well, here's why that's important. It gets into supply chain. So SolarWinds was a company that had this stuff called network management system software, and it was like antivirus is on a computer. If you want antivirus to work, which it's outdated now, but we've got modern stuff, endpoint protection. But in those days, antivirus to work, you had to give it access to everything. Well, this network management service had access to everything. So what Russia figured out is we don't have to break into Fort Knox. What we have to do is break into the trucks that are going into Fort Knox. So what they did is they got into the company called SolarWinds, which did not do a good job from a cybersecurity standpoint. And they were able to put a piece of code into the update server, and they tested it. It's like the Chinese spy balloon. They tested it out there. Did anybody find it? And when nobody found it, they were able to then to assemble the full package. What people did, if you remember the day, and Jim, I don't want to say you're old enough to remember, but you are old enough to remember. Do you remember getting the Novell or the Windows NT, but the diskettes, they'd come in shrink wrap. So what would you do? You'd break the shrink wrap and you'd update your operating system with the 3.5-inch diskettes, right?
Now that I do remember, yes.
Well, Kevin Mitnick was a guy that actually couple of the FBI agents that I trained, Kevin Mitnick, I ended up knowing him years later. One of the things he did was he put his back door into the 3.5-inch diskettes. He would shrink wrap them up and then deliver them to the company. So when they found the back door, what would they do? They'd erase they'd get rid of the back door, then they'd go to their software and they'd reinstall the same back door in over and over again. Well, this is what they learned the lesson in SolarWinds. So what happened was they'd take these updates and they'd put them in. Now, how many people were analyzing every update that came in, reverse engineering it? They weren't. There's no way to do it, right? So what people would do is the updates would come in, they'd put them into what's called a sandbox, a safe area, look at it for 3 or 4 days. Back then, cloud storage was expensive, so storing your telemetry for more than 10 days to 2 weeks was prohibitive. So all Russia did was they said, look, we're going to build a software package that once we get in there, we're going to wait 14 days, then we're going to pop up our little periscope and we're going to look around. And when we find out we're in the right environment, then we're going to execute. And when you would go back from a forensic standpoint and say, let's look at the logs, let's look at our telemetry, there was nothing there because they waited until it was erased. It's like the old VCRs when I was a detective, we called them stop and robs, right? If you don't get in there early enough, they're just gonna record over the same tape over and over again. Well, this is what happened with SolarWinds, and they got into the National Nuclear Stockpile Agency. They got into the State Department. They got into a lot of things we did not want them inside, but they did it by getting into the update server. We implicitly trusted updates that came to us. We put them into our system, and then all Russia did was play the waiting game. They didn't outcode us, Jim. They outthought us.
Well, listening to you, Morgan, 2 things occur to me. Certainly the rules of the game when it comes to espionage have certainly been changed by the development of technology, and I guess it's just accelerating more so every day. And I'm getting a little nervous listening to you about what the future might hold. But I'm sure we're doing things too that are gonna counter what some of the things we've heard tonight that the Russians are doing. Bruce, please continue with some more questions for Morgan.
Thank you, Jim. Morgan, that 12 over 10 on the concern scale is certainly concerning. How does advanced technology and offensive cyber operations affect geopolitics?
So when we were talking earlier, Bruce, and I said, look, Russia uses proxies. This becomes useful tools for Russia. So I talk about, for example, ransomware. A lot of people have heard about ransomware. They know what it does. They know what it is. But so you have to look at how does Russia employ this, right? So if I can make you spend money defending against attacks or divert your attention and do other things or create large-scale attacks against infrastructure and critical infrastructure, you're spending time, energy, money, resources solving a problem that keeps coming at you. So Russia figured this out. So there was another study that was done. Chain Analysis is a group that does a lot of research. And so when we look at the world, the world today and the rise of Bitcoin did not become valuable until the dark web. And the reason that happened is because on the dark web, you had Pirate Bay, you had Silk Road, you had all of these people that were selling stuff, but the only way they could sell it, they needed to have a mechanism, a financial mechanism that would allow them to remain anonymous. Bitcoin was anonymous. So fast forward to today, and ransomware groups, when they extort, guess what they take their payment in? Bitcoin. Well, for Bitcoin to work, you have to be on the block. All these transactions are recorded on the blockchain ledger. So Chain Analysis did research, and they said, let's look at all the ransomware payments around the world and where they go to. I don't do trick questions, Bruce, so I'll ask you, where do 74% of all ransomware payments in the world, what country do they end up going to?
I would guess Russia.
What do we have for him, Johnny? Russia. Yes, Russia. It's like the Brady Bunch, for those of you old enough to remember. Marsha. Well, Russia. 74%. What does that tell you? Russia has figured out how to use third-party groups like DarkSide and other groups to conduct ransomware attacks or offensive attacks at arm's length so that it's not tied directly to them. But these groups also monetize themselves through the use of Bitcoin and blockchain ledger. And Russia's theory is that, hey, look, comrade, as long as you're not attacking us, all is good. So capitalism is a good thing, especially when you're a ransomware group and you're attacking everybody else. So one of the lessons we learned is that we don't do that. I mean, I will tell you, as far as I know, but the United States, when we engage in proxy groups, we're not doing it to attack other people's critical infrastructure or things that are life dependent, like health, welfare, safety, critical communications, right? We do go after military because those are valid targets, intelligence, but we don't go after infrastructure the same way Russia or China do. But the fact that they're using third-party groups to do this, Vladimir Putin, there is not a group in Russia that does not operate without the implicit approval of the Russian government. Not explicit, he may not know it explicitly, but implicitly they operate, and this is what we see. Ransomware is not just a transnational criminal issue, Bruce. It's a geopolitical tool that is wielded by Russia to advance their national interests and advance their political goals in various countries around the world.
Well, one of the many things we've been learning from your presentation tonight, Morgan, is that warfare has changed a lot. What, in your opinion, has been one of the major changes?
This goes back to, Bruce, I was flying out of Dulles Airport. I live in Northern Virginia, so I was flying to Las Vegas for a convention or something one time, and I happened to be in there. And I saw an older man, and he had a hat on that said LST, and I don't remember which LST it was, but landing craft. Well, that was a World War II thing. So I get talking with him. My dad was a World War II veteran, and that they're our greatest generation. Within my lifetime, Bruce, and I know within years, we will lose the last member of World War II. But I'm sitting there talking with him, and I said, "What's going on?" He said, "Well, I was Navy. I was an LST operator, and I was in the South Pacific, but they needed me for D-Day. So he got pulled from the South Pacific to Europe for D-Day, and he was one of the people ferrying people from the boats, from the ships, the troop carriers to the shore. And when he was there, when then D-Day happened, right? And then so I'm sitting there talking with him, and I said, "So what's your name?" Well, when she answers me, she's got a distinctive accent. I said, "Are you Dutch?" Because I'd worked with the Dutch police before, been over there, many times. She goes, "Yeah." She was a member of the Dutch resistance, Bruce. He met her after they invaded, if they came in, and she was one of the people waving the orange flags, that the Dutch would do, the orange. But her story was so compelling because during World War II, she was a member of the Dutch resistance. She was sneaking secret documents, and she was helping SOE, the Special Operations Executive agents, cross borders and down flyers, get back to where they were. And it got me thinking, is that during World War II and during even Vietnam, when you look at partisan groups, the resistance or partisan groups, you didn't have to be just ideologically aligned. You had to also be geographically aligned. So if I wanted to help you, I could sit in England and give money to the resistance, but never be there. But if you wanted to actually be involved, you actually had to geographically be there too. Well, the internet has no concept of distance. So what we see now is that the rise of cyber partisan groups, we're seeing a lot of them, Cyberfront Z, which is a Russian group, that is actually, I thought it was interesting. If those of you remember, old enough to remember the original Red Dawn, but Wolverines, right? But a lot of the Russian troops or the Russian armor that was burned up, somebody wrote Wolverines on them, but they had Z on there for the Russians. So there was Cyberfront Z. There was a new group called No Name 057 that targets NATO. But Belarus, so this actually one of the things I predicted from the original Cyber Strike Warfare in the Fifth Domain, the 2013 presentation. If Russia's going to do this, they're going to do it wrapped around a military exercise, which is called Zapad. It's the quadrennial exercise they do. And guess who they do it with? They do it with Belarus. Where did Russia invade Ukraine this time? Through Belarus, where they had 15,000 troops staged. Well, there's a group there called the Belarus Cyber Partisans, and you might think that these partisans are aligned against Ukraine and with Russia. No. These citizens are not supportive of their government and what's going on. They're actually attacking the train control systems. They're attacking the logistics, because Russia is very heavily dependent upon rail to move men and materials, bombs and bullets. So they're moving that, through logistics that way. And so these Belarus cyber partisans are doing this. But if you guys want to have fun, for those of you that get on like Telegram, the encrypted messaging app, or Signal, but on Telegram, the IT Army of Ukraine on a daily basis posts targeting information. Here's the IP addresses. Here's the websites we're going after. You can now participate from the comfort of your own home, Bruce, and launch a cyber attack against Russia and never leave your cush office that you have there with all of your well-deserved awards. And you could actually become a partisan because you align ideologically. You no longer have to align geographically to do that.
That's very discomforting. Considering my lack of technical knowledge, I'd probably wind up blowing up my own equipment. But thanks for the good thought. You have described the offsets of war. What are they, and how do they apply to cyber?
So, in World War II, the only nation to ever drop a nuclear weapon in war has been the United States. So from World War II, from that point forward till about 1960, we achieved the first offset of war, which is we had numerical superiority and technical superiority because we had nuclear capability. It took Russia another 11 years after they tested their first bomb in 1949 to where they achieved parity with us, which was around 1960. So we had an offset of war. In other words, we had an asymmetric capability, an advantage that nobody else had until about 1960. Then when that happened, that first offset ceased to exist. But then we started looking at what's the second offset. Well, what Russia had, if you think about the Warsaw Pact and you think about NATO and you think about Eastern Europe and Poland, if Russia wanted to invade, they would be, or Soviet Union at that time, let me be context specific. The Soviet Union at that time, they could take in a massive force and invade Poland, let's say, and they could have numerical superiority, and it would take a long time for NATO to be able to assemble forces together. But what we did have is we had a technological capability, a superiority in there. So we came up with what's called look deep, shoot deep. Even though Russia might get the initial forces, what we wanted to take out what are called follow-on forces. So think of the Marines landing and holding the beach, and then the Army coming behind them and holding. So it's called seize, hold, clear, build. So you would come in and seize initially. So one thing we found we could do, because Russia did not have the technical capability and superiority that we did, so we were able to offset the numerical superiority with look deep, shoot deep. If you did invade Poland or Eastern Europe or go somewhere, your initial forces might get in there, and as we're spinning up NATO to respond to that, we would just take out everything with look deep, shoot deep, and take out all of your armor and all of your follow-on forces till the point of where we would hold on long enough and there'd be enough attrition to where then NATO would then obtain a numerical and a technical superiority, and we'd be able to push Russia back. So we actually had that, and that's what kept things from... Now, Russia invaded Georgia. Russia, there were some other incursions that they did, but never anything on a massive scale, and nothing against a NATO partner, because that would have invoked the Washington Treaty. But then what happened was on a Christmas day, on a fine Christmas day, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and the Warsaw Pact went away. So now we're looking at years later, and we're saying, okay, what's the third offset of war? And I asked people, what do you think the third offset of war? What is going to give somebody an asymmetric capability? Well, the big arms race right now is not nuclear, it's AI. AI will become the third offset of war. And then we have these things called laws, lethal autonomous weapon systems. There is a video out there right now. If you folks want to go to the interwebs, if you're listening in and type in Russian robot firing guns, you're going to see something that looks like RoboCop and a robot holding two Glocks. and it's firing at these metal targets, and it's hitting every single one of them. Its accuracy is uncanny. So we're looking at how does AI play a factor in the decision-making loop, observation, orientation, decision, action. So they're looking at how do we automate the system to where we can target, identify, and engage. We still have a moral clause in what we do where we said we still want, from an ethical standpoint, to have a human in the loop making decisions. Just because I can shoot doesn't mean I should shoot. So we still have humans in the loop, but Russia, China. So AI is that third offset of war. Putin has come out and said whoever controls AI controls the world. We're seeing it's a huge arms race right now. The NVIDIA chips, AMD, the things that are going on. But Bruce, but then I get into say, well, if that's the third offset of war, what becomes the fourth offset of war? And it's quantum computing. The things that we believe are safe now. I just did a webinar as my role as senior fellow for Central Digital Government with HP on quantum resistant printers. I mean, quantum resistant printing. NSA had guidelines out there that says we want quantum resistant printers by 2030. Now they've moved it up. Now they want them by 2028, which tells you that the threat vector out there, the threat landscape has evolved significantly to where we've moved up a timeline significantly, orders of magnitude, to get there. So, I mean, we're seeing a lot of movement out there, but quantum computing will render a lot of things we consider safe obsolete.
Thank you, Morgan. Lots to think about there. Jim, back to you.
So Morgan, we're closing in on our time frame for the SigTalks, so we'd like a few more questions for you.
Yep.
What would be your closing statement regarding all that we've heard about tonight? How would you summarize things for us that our audience can take away?
So never listen to what Russia says, listen to what they do. So and this actually, I know I went a little long, sorry, I was talking. I get carried away on this stuff, but during the Cold War, when they had the KGB had what we called three main adversaries. The United States, NATO, and I asked people, who was the third one? Hardly anybody ever gets this. It's China. China was an adversary of Russia. So I said, now that it's gentler, kindler, friendly, what is today? They have three main targets: the United States, NATO, and China. China is a frenemy. It's not a friend, but I mean they're cooperating. What I would say is that look, I mean this world is changing significantly. The rate of change is like Moore's law, right? Computing power doubles every 36 months. We're seeing things increase exponentially. The announcements of people like Johnny Ives and his new company IO merging and are getting acquired by OpenAI, and we're now having AI embedded into hardware and these new kind of capabilities. I mean, we have to be flexible, and this is where I go back to Jim. It has to be about critical thinking. We cannot legislate our way out of this. You can't say, well, let's create something for this. It's going to change too fast. What we have to do is we have to think about what's the problem we're trying to solve. What are the boundaries of our thinking? We need to expand our boundaries. And I'll tell you one thing, if I were going to do something in college, I would teach critical thinking. I mean, we've got to get past people. There's a professor out there in one of the colleges that has created a test that you cannot use ChatGPT or AI to take his test with. However he's done it, it's probably brilliant, but the students are complaining, well, I can't use GPT. That's the whole point. You've got to reason this out. We can't let machines do our thinking for us. So I'd say one of the biggest things that concerns me that comes out of all of this, the things that we used to do and the things that we thought were normal are no longer normal. AI technology has changed everything from the types of threats we face to the types of ways that the economy is changing, the new businesses that are out there. The future is going to be people who have figured out how to harness AI and build businesses with it. So my biggest thing out of this is that you can worry about stuff all day long. I don't let things worry me. What I say is, what can I do? What's my part that I can do? Even as a single person, using strong passwords, making sure things that are encrypted, never giving out your personally identifiable information, things like that. There's a lot of things we can do personally to keep this kind of stuff from happening. But AI is going to be developed. Quantum computing is going to be here. What we have to do is say, are we as a country in giving and helping support the creation of these institutions that enable critical thinking so we can have people thinking about these problems, about how we're going to solve them in the future?
Well, thanks for anticipating a question that I was going to ask, which is, what can the average citizen really do about all this? And I think you laid out a few things. And I really like your description of critical thinking. I know that's something that is really what advances a country beyond its peers. When you have more people with that capability, and certainly has been a factor in the success of the United States over almost three centuries now. So I'm going to turn the tables on you a little bit, Morgan, to wrap things up and bring it back to Sigma Chi and how Sigma Chi has personally impacted you. I mean, what would you have to say about, it's great to hear that you're involved with the fraternity quite a bit still. And what would you say about how it's impacted your personal and professional development?
When I got out of college, I started off as a rookie police officer in Salina, and I still kept in touch with fraternity brothers. Remember, this is pre-internet. You'd meet up for a meeting, you'd get a postcard or something. And then as I moved, I kind of lost touch for a while because there were no groups. But let me tell you, I think one of the things that fundamentally changed me is I was in the Reagan building on 9/11. We were supposed to be in the Pentagon. We ended up being in the Reagan building that day. I remember walking across the bridge. I saw the Pentagon burning. And I said, personally for me, never again. I want to do my part. And sounds corny, but it's serious for me. It's serious. I mean, I'm still a cop at heart. You cut me, I bleed blue. I still believe in the defending and protecting against all enemies, foreign and domestic. But as I was out here in Northern Virginia, I said, look, I miss having those people that don't know me from Adam, but because we share a common bond. It's like in law enforcement. You go you conference somewhere and somebody's a cop, you have that secret handshake. Well, we have our handshake. We have our ritual. We have our investiture. And so I sought things out, and I started just hanging around a little bit, started finding out the things that were going on, and I decided, hey, what can I do to, as we say in the Kansas Farm Boy stuff, what can I do to leave the woodpile a little higher? How can I help the new incoming brothers, the pledges, the graduating seniors, the ones that are going out into this world? And for me, it was just, how do I find a way to do the things that were done for me? Pay it forward, right? So this is very much a pay it forward thing. How can I help the next generation of leaders become men, graduate from boys and college and become men, and become the next leaders of our country, as you see in Congress, which Bruce always arranges a fantastic congressional luncheon. We have more Sigma Chi's in Congress than any other place. This is the natural outcome of it. When you have a program dedicated to leadership and developing men, this is the result of it. I just want to be a part of it.
Well, we're glad you're continuing to be a part of it and to do your part, because I think if we all contribute in just even a small way, we'll continue to build and have a great fraternity. Look, at this point, I'd like to turn it over to our producer to see if we have a question or two for Morgan.
Do we just stockpile seeds and water gathering items? No, but let me tell you, this is not prepper talk. This is not conspiracy talk. The government even says you should be prepared to go 72 hours without intervention of the government, without any assistance from the government. That means power. That means water. That means food, communications capability. We do have a way to stop it. The thing is, our grid's not really going to collapse. It's very balkanized, so it's like there's all these different things. So I don't think we're going to have a grid collapse. We might have attacks on it, but I would just say just simple things. In my vehicle, one of the things I've prepared for is I have first aid kits in there. I have a gunshot kit. I have a first responder kit in there. I've got some supplies in there that should I get stuck out on the highway, I can survive. So I think part of this is that we've gone from a time to where nothing cyber, we never heard we didn't even know what the word internet was, to where now everything we have is connected to the internet. By the way, living in Loudoun County, 80% of the world's internet traffic goes through Loudoun County, Virginia. We have more data centers per square mile than any place in the United States.
Producer, do we have another question?
That's a great one. How does Putin's background impact what Russia is doing in the cyberspace Cold War? Putin is a product of the KGB. He wasn't as big in it as a lot of people think he was. He was kind of at the regional level. But Putin is very much a strategist. He, in fact, one of the slides we didn't get to, but I'll just touch on it here. When I say the name, how many people know the name Brittany Griner? A lot of people raise their hand. If I say how many people know the name Victor Boot? Not too many people know. One of my friends from DEA, Rob Zaharashevsky, what ran the DEA operation called Operation Relentless to get Victor Boot. Victor Boot was identified by the UN as supplying the arms and ammunition to warlords and people in sub-Saharan Africa, responsible for the death of 6 million people. Yet we traded him for Brittany Griner because the Russians understood the long game. They understood how to play this. So this is very much a product of Putin and how he negotiates. If he wants something, he will take something and use it as leverage to get it from you because he understands we're the good guys. We fight with one hand behind our back. He does not fight with one hand behind his back. So, I mean, this is how his background contributes to cyberspace. It's very much an equalizer for him and an offensive weapon, and he will never give it up. No matter how many treaties we enter into, Russia will always be doing this.
Again, a little bit scary when you hear what you have to say there. And I think he's been in place 25 years now, and probably no end in sight. Well, let me remind our audience that with all that Morgan has covered this evening, I think it's worth a second listen. And if you'd like to do that, just plug into the Sigma Chi Learning Consortium, go to past events, and you'll find a recording of tonight's talk with Morgan on there, probably by tomorrow. Morgan, we can't thank you enough for your appearance tonight. It was really enlightening, and I think you covered a lot of ground that many of us just didn't even know about. Bruce, any final comments for Morgan?
Morgan, your usual excellent work product. I think there's enough on the table that we might like to invite you back if you'd consider it. And I'd like to thank our brothers who logged on tonight and that will be listening through the consortium later on. Hope you'll avail yourselves of this excellent information that we've learned tonight.
Well, and look, as you guys can see, I'm coin operator. Put a coin in me. I can talk for a long time about this stuff. So I'd be happy to. Anytime, I'd be happy to come back and just share my thoughts, what I know. But at the end of the day, I tell you, I would not be where I was had it not been for that early grounding in Sigma Chi, and then meeting brothers out here like Bruce and other people going through the Ritual 2.0 training, and getting more involved and deeper into the history. I mean, I'm proud to be a SIG, so I appreciate you allowing me on just to chat about this and expose people to a world that they may not know is out there.
Well, having you as a SIG is great news for all of us. Thanks again, Morgan. And let's just say goodnight to our audience, and we'll see you next month.